A 72-year-old driver gets pulled over, not for speeding, not for running a red light, but for something they didn't even realize they were supposed to report. A few weeks later, there's a $500 fine, a flagged license, and a confusing letter from the DMV that seems to come out of nowhere. In another case, someone walks into a routine license renewal thinking it'll take 10 minutes and walks out without a license at all. No warning, no clear explanation, just a rule they didn't know had changed. And here's the part that should concern you. These aren't rare situations. They're happening more and more, and most people only find out after it's already cost them money, stress, or even their ability to drive. Because the truth is, the rules around driving, especially for seniors, have changed quietly, not with big announcements or clear notices, but in small updates, buried policies, and state-by-state changes that millions of people never hear about. And if you've been driving for decades, doing everything the same way you always have, it's incredibly easy to miss something that suddenly matters. The system now expects you to know things that until recently you were never responsible for. And if you don't, that's where the fines, penalties, and surprises start showing up. So the question is, what exactly changed? And why are so many experienced drivers getting caught off guard by it? Hi, I'm Sophia, and I want to walk you through this in the simplest, clearest way possible because this is one of those topics where confusion can actually cost you, not just money, but your independence. And whether you're over 65 yourself or you're thinking about a parent or grandparent who still drives, what we're going to cover here matters more than most people realize. I'm going to break down what's actually changed, the specific rule that's catching people off guard right now, and what you can do today to avoid becoming one of those stories we just talked about. We'll go step by step in plain English. No legal jargon, no complicated language, just a clear understanding of what's happening behind the scenes and how it affects you in real life. Because once you see how these rules work together, you'll understand why so many people feel blindsided by them. And more importantly, how to stay one step ahead. And there's one specific requirement, something most drivers have never even heard of, that's leading to those $500 fines and license issues we started with. That's where we're heading next. For most people, driving has always followed a pretty simple pattern. You learn when you're young, you pass your test, you get your license. And from that point on, it's mostly routine. Every few years, you renew it. Maybe you take a new photo, pay a small fee, and that's it. Decade after decade, the system works the same way. And if you're someone who's been driving for 40, 50, even 60 years, that consistency builds a kind of trust. You know the rules. You understand the road. You've done this your whole life without any major issues. So there's no reason to think anything has changed. And for a long time, that assumption was actually built into the system itself. The idea was simple. Once you've proven you can drive safely, you'll probably continue to do so. But over time, something started to show up in the data, not in a dramatic headline-grabbing way, but slowly and consistently enough that it couldn't be ignored. Researchers began noticing that accident rates among older drivers were beginning to rise, not because seniors suddenly became reckless drivers, but because certain changes that come with age can affect driving in subtle ways. Things like vision becoming less sharp, reaction time slowing just a bit, or medical conditions that develop gradually over time. And this is important to understand clearly. These are not character flaws. They're not about experience or responsibility. In fact, many older drivers are among the safest and most cautious on the road. But the reality is, even small physical or cognitive changes can have an impact behind the wheel, especially in fast-moving or unpredictable situations. Add to that the fact that many people begin taking medications that can cause drowsiness or delayed reactions, and you start to see why regulators began taking a closer look at how licensing works for older drivers. So, over the past couple of decades, states didn't make one big, obvious change. Instead, they introduced a series of smaller, quieter updates, what are often called age-based driving regulations. These are rules that only apply once you reach a certain age, sometimes 70, sometimes 75, depending on the state. And here's where things start to get tricky. These changes weren't always clearly explained. There was no universal announcement, no moment where everyone was told, Hey, the rules are different now. Instead, they were phased in gradually, buried in DMV updates, policy documents, and renewal notices that are easy to overlook, which means a lot of people are still driving under the assumption that nothing has really changed, when in reality, the expectations have shifted in ways that can catch you completely off guard. And this is exactly where the biggest and most expensive mistake is happening right now. Because one of these quiet rule changes doesn't just affect how you renew your license or how often you visit the DMV. It affects what you're legally required to report about your own health. And most people don't even realize that responsibility exists until it's already too late. And this is where things take a turn that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. In a growing number of states, once you reach a certain age, you may be legally required to report certain medical conditions directly to your state's Department of Motor Vehicles, not your doctor, not your insurance company, you. And for a lot of people, that's the moment everything clicks, and also the moment they realize no one ever clearly told them this. Now, let's break this down in plain English because the wording around this can get confusing fast. There are specific medical conditions that states consider potentially relevant to driving safety. We're not just talking about extreme or obvious situations. Yes, something like a major stroke would qualify, but so can much more subtle diagnoses. Things like mild cognitive impairment, early-stage neurological conditions, certain seizure disorders, and in some cases, even well-managed chronic conditions depending on how they affect alertness or reaction time. These are things your doctor might mention during a routine visit without framing them as anything urgent. Here's the part that catches people off guard. In many states, your doctor is not the one responsible for reporting this information. In fact, due to privacy laws, they often can't report it without your consent. So, the system shifts that responsibility onto you. The expectation is that if something about your health changes in a way that could impact your driving, you will proactively inform the DMV. And if you don't, if you genuinely had no idea you were supposed to, and it later comes up during a traffic stop, an accident, or even a routine review, the consequences can be immediate. We're talking about fines that can reach $500 or more, points on your license, and in some cases, a suspension until the situation is reviewed. And what makes this so frustrating for many people is that they weren't trying to hide anything. They were doing exactly what they've always done, going to their doctor, following medical advice, living their lives, and suddenly they're being treated as if they failed to comply with a rule they didn't even know existed. That's why this particular requirement is catching so many experienced drivers off guard right now. If there's one moment in this video where it's worth pausing and thinking about someone else in your life, it's right here. Because chances are you know someone, maybe a parent, maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend, who would have no idea this rule exists. Sharing this kind of information early can save them from a situation that feels confusing and completely avoidable after the fact. Now, as significant as that rule is, it's only one piece of a larger shift because at the same time these reporting requirements have been expanding, states have also been quietly changing how license renewals work for older drivers. And this is another area where people are getting tripped up without realizing why. You might have spent decades renewing your license the exact same way. Maybe you've been doing it by mail, maybe online. Maybe it's always been quick and predictable, something you never had to think twice about. But in many states, once you cross a certain age threshold, that process changes. Suddenly, you're no longer eligible to renew by mail or online. You're required to appear in person at a DMV office. And not only that, but the frequency of renewal may increase. What used to be every 8 years might now be every 4 or even every 2. And if you miss that change, if you continue following the old routine without realizing the rules have shifted, your license can be flagged without much warning. That's how people end up in situations that feel completely out of the blue. They think they've done everything right. They submitted their renewal, paid their fee, followed the same steps they've followed for years, and then a notice arrives saying there's an issue. Not because they did something reckless, but because the process itself changed and no one clearly explained it. And what happens next when you do show up in person is where things can become even more surprising. Because once you do walk into that DMV office for an in-person renewal, there's one part of the process that seems simple on the surface, but has become one of the most common reasons seniors unexpectedly lose their license, and that's the vision test. Now, most people hear that and think, no problem, I've been driving for years. My vision is fine. And maybe it is, at least in day-to-day life. You can read, you can watch TV, you can recognize faces across the room, but the standard the DMV uses isn't based on comfort. It's based on specific legal thresholds that have in many places quietly changed. What catches people off guard is that these standards are often stricter than they remember, and they haven't had to think about them in years. So, someone walks in expecting a routine renewal and ends up struggling with a test they didn't prepare for. And just like that, the outcome shifts. Instead of walking out with a renewed license, they're told their vision doesn't meet the minimum requirement. Now they have to schedule an eye exam, submit additional paperwork, sometimes even pause their driving entirely until it's resolved. It's not meant to punish, it's meant to ensure safety. But if you didn't know the standard had changed, it can feel like the ground just shifted under your feet. And here's what makes this especially frustrating. This is one of the most preventable issues on the list. A simple, up-to-date eye exam with an optometrist or ophthalmologist can catch problems early, update your prescription, and make sure you meet the required standard before you ever step into the DMV. But without that awareness, people are walking in unprepared, sometimes literally, to a test that now carries much higher stakes than it used to. Now, as surprising as that is, there's another rule that affects even more people. And this one tends to shock almost everyone when they hear it because it involves something incredibly common: prescription medication. If you take medication regularly, and many seniors do, there's a detail you've probably seen countless times without giving it much thought. That small warning label on the bottle: may cause drowsiness. Do not operate heavy machinery. For years, most people treated that as a general caution, something to be aware of, but not necessarily something that would affect your daily routine in a serious way. But in several states, that label is now being interpreted much more strictly in certain situations. If you're involved in an accident or pulled over and an officer observes signs that could be interpreted as impaired driving, maybe slight swerving, slower reaction time, or difficulty focusing, and you're taking a medication that carries one of those warnings, that combination can be enough to trigger serious consequences. In some cases, it can be treated similarly to driving under the influence, not because you did anything intentionally wrong and not because you were taking anything illegal, but because the law now considers the potential impact of that medication on your ability to drive safely. And that's the part that feels so unexpected for people. You're taking something your doctor prescribed, something you've possibly been on for years, and suddenly it's part of a legal evaluation of your driving. To be very clear, the answer here is not to stop taking your medication. That's a medical decision that should only ever be made with your doctor. The real takeaway is awareness, understanding that these warnings are no longer just suggestions. They can carry real weight depending on the situation. So, the smartest step you can take is a simple one. Have a direct, honest conversation with your doctor about your medications and driving. Ask specifically whether anything you're taking, either on its own or in combination, could affect your alertness, reaction time, or coordination behind the wheel, and if there's ever a day where something feels off, maybe you didn't sleep well, maybe a new medication is affecting you differently, it's okay to recognize that and give yourself a break from driving. That kind of awareness isn't limiting your independence, it's protecting it. Because when you start putting all of these pieces together, the reporting requirements, the renewal changes, the vision standards, the medication rules, you begin to see the bigger picture. The system hasn't just changed in one way, it's changed in several overlapping ways at once. And that's exactly why so many people feel blindsided by it. And when you look at all of these changes together, there's one misunderstanding that keeps coming up again and again, and it's causing a lot of unnecessary problems. A lot of people assume that if their doctor says they're okay to drive, then they're completely covered. It feels logical, right? You trust your doctor, they know your health better than anyone, and if they give you the green light, that should mean you're good to go. But here's where things get a little more complicated than most people expect. Medical approval and legal compliance are not the same thing. Your doctor is evaluating your health, your ability to function, your overall condition, whether you're safe from a medical standpoint. But the DMV is evaluating something different. They're looking at whether all of their specific requirements have been met. Reporting rules, renewal procedures, documentation, vision standards, and in some cases, disclosures about medications or conditions. Those are administrative rules, and they exist in a completely separate system from your doctor's office. So it's entirely possible, and this is what surprises people, to be told by your doctor you're fine to drive and still run into legal issues because something wasn't reported properly or a requirement wasn't fulfilled. Not because you did anything reckless, but because the two systems don't automatically communicate with each other. And unless you know that ahead of time, it's easy to assume you're covered when you're not. One system is based on medical judgment, the other is based on legal responsibility. And both matter. To make this a little more real, let me give you an example that brings all of this together. Imagine someone, we'll call him Frank. Frank is 74 years old. He's been driving for over 5 decades. Clean record, no accidents, no issues. The kind of driver who knows every road in his area and takes pride in being careful. He goes to his annual checkup and his doctor tells him he's doing well. Maybe his blood pressure is a little high, but it's controlled. Nothing alarming. From Frank's perspective, everything is normal. Life continues the way it always has. So, Frank keeps doing what he's always done. He drives to the grocery store, to family gatherings, to his grandkids' events. When it's time to renew his license, he follows the same process he's followed for years, submits his renewal the way he always has, pays the fee, and doesn't think twice about it. Why would he? It's worked every time before. Then one day, a letter shows up. His license has been flagged. There's an issue with his renewal. He's now required to come in person to the DMV. No one clearly told him that the rules had changed, that mail-in renewal was no longer valid for his age group. So now he's sitting in a waiting room trying to understand what went wrong. When he gets to the counter, he's asked to complete a vision test, something he hasn't had to do in years. He struggles more than he expected, not because he can't see, but because his prescription hasn't been updated recently. Now, that's another step he has to deal with. Then, as part of the paperwork, he lists the medications he's taking. One of them carries a standard warning label, something he's never thought twice about, but now it raises questions. Suddenly, what Frank thought would be a routine visit has turned into a series of unexpected hurdles. Nothing about Frank's situation is extreme. Nothing about it is unusual. And that's exactly the point. This is how these situations unfold. Not with one big mistake, but with a series of small, perfectly understandable assumptions. Assumptions based on how things used to work, not how they work now. And the result is stress, confusion, and in many cases, delays or restrictions that could have been avoided with the right information at the right time. That's why understanding these changes isn't just helpful, it's protective. Because once you see how these pieces connect, you can start making small adjustments that prevent big problems later. So let's shift from what's happening to what you can actually do about it, because this is the part that gives you back control. And the good news is, none of this requires anything extreme or complicated. It's really about being a little more proactive in a system that no longer runs on autopilot. The first step is simply to find out what the rules are in your specific state. And I know that sounds obvious, but this is where a lot of people get stuck because the information isn't always presented clearly. You might have to dig a little. Go to your state's DMV website and search for terms like senior driver requirements or license renewal over 70. Look for anything that specifically mentions age-based rules, and when you find it, don't just skim it, save it, print it out, or write down the key points. Because having that information in front of you removes a huge amount of uncertainty. The second step is to double-check your license renewal process. Not just when it expires, but how you're expected to renew it now. Are you still allowed to do it online or by mail, or are you required to appear in person? Has the renewal period changed from what you're used to? If you're not completely sure, it's worth making a quick call to your DMV and asking directly. And when you do, write down what they tell you. It may seem like a small thing, but having clarity here can prevent the kind of situation we talked about earlier. The third step, and this is one of the most impactful, is to get a current, comprehensive eye exam. Not the quick screen at the DMV, but a full exam with an eye specialist. Make sure your prescription is up to date and ask directly whether your vision meets your state's legal requirements for driving. This alone can prevent one of the most common surprises people face during in-person renewals. It's simple, it's manageable, and it puts you in a much stronger position walking into that appointment. The fourth step is to have a focused conversation with your doctor about your medications and your driving, not a general conversation. Be specific. Bring a list of everything you take and ask clearly whether any of those medications alone or in combination could affect your alertness, coordination, or reaction time. And if there are concerns, ask about alternatives or adjustments. This isn't about limiting your options. It's about understanding them so you can make informed decisions. Now, there's one more step that doesn't get talked about as often, but it matters just as much, and that's communication within your family. Because in many cases, the people closest to you may notice small changes before you do. And if you're on the other side of that, if you're watching a parent or a loved one who still drives, this can be a difficult topic to bring up. No one wants to feel like they're taking away someone's independence. Driving represents freedom, routine, dignity. It's deeply personal, so these conversations need to be handled with care, but avoiding them completely can lead to much harder situations later. Situations where decisions are made suddenly under stress after something has already gone wrong. A better approach is to make it about information, not judgment. Instead of saying, "I'm worried about your driving," you can start with something like, "I came across some new driving rules for seniors. Have you heard about these?" That shifts the conversation. It makes it collaborative instead of confrontational. You're not questioning their ability, you're sharing something useful. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about taking keys away. It's about making sure that the ability to drive and everything that comes with it lasts as long as possible safely and without interruption. And sometimes the simplest conversations are the ones that make the biggest difference. Now, there's another layer to all of this that doesn't get nearly enough attention, but it's becoming more common every year, especially as these rules continue to change, and that's scams. Anytime there's confusion, urgency, or new regulations, especially ones that affect seniors, there are people ready to take advantage of it. Here's how it usually shows up. You might get a phone call, a text message, or even a letter that looks official at first glance. It might say your license is at risk, that you failed to comply with a new requirement, or that you need to complete a mandatory course or pay a fee immediately to avoid suspension. And the message is almost always designed to create pressure. It sounds urgent. It feels serious. It pushes you to act quickly without thinking too much about it, but there are a few things you need to know that can protect you immediately. Real DMV communications are not designed to rush you into panic decisions. They don't call you demanding payment on the spot. They don't send text messages with suspicious links asking for personal information. And they certainly don't threaten to suspend your license within 24 hours unless you act immediately. Those are classic red flags. If you ever receive something like that, the safest thing you can do is pause. Don't click any links. Don't call back the number they gave you. Instead, go directly to your state's official DMV website, find their verified phone number, and contact them yourself. Ask if there's actually anything you need to take care of. Most of the time, you'll find out there isn't. And even in cases where there is something legitimate, the real process will be clear, structured, and give you time to respond properly. Now, looking ahead, there are also some updates happening right now, especially in 2026, that are making this situation even more important to stay on top of. Several states are expanding their medical self-reporting requirements, meaning more conditions may fall under the category of what needs to be disclosed. If you live in a state that's recently updated its traffic or public safety laws, it's worth taking a few minutes to see whether those updates apply to your age group. At the same time, some states are introducing what are called graduated license restoration programs, and this is actually a positive development. These programs are designed for drivers who may have had their license restricted or suspended, not as a permanent loss, but as a step in a process. For example, Someone might temporarily move to a restricted license, daytime driving only, or within a certain distance from home, and then through evaluations or safe driving assessments, work their way back toward full driving privileges. It's a more flexible approach that recognizes that driving ability isn't always all or nothing. There's also a growing focus on vehicle technology. Newer cars come equipped with features like automatic emergency braking, lane departure warnings, and driver assistance systems that can significantly improve safety. Some states are beginning to incorporate basic familiarity with these features into their expectations for drivers, especially older drivers who may be using newer vehicles. So, if you've recently upgraded your car or you're planning to, it's worth taking the time to really understand how those features work, not just for convenience, but because they're becoming part of the broader safety conversation. And this is a good moment to check in. If you've made it this far, you're already doing something most people don't do, which is taking the time to actually understand how these changes affect you. If you have a specific question about your state or a situation you're dealing with, feel free to share it. There's a lot of variation from one place to another, and sometimes a quick answer can save you a lot of time and frustration, because when you zoom out and look at everything we've covered so far, one thing becomes very clear. This isn't just one rule. It's a series of small shifts happening all at once, and staying informed is what keeps those shifts from turning into problems. When you take a step back and look at all of this together, it can feel like a lot. New rules, different requirements, things that weren't part of the system for most of your life suddenly mattering in very real ways. But underneath all of it, there's a much simpler idea holding everything together, and it's one that often gets lost in the details. Driving isn't just about getting from one place to another. For millions of people, especially seniors, it represents something much bigger. It's independence. It's the ability to decide when you leave the house, where you go, how you spend your day. It's being able to show up for the small, meaningful moments, doctor's appointments, family visits, grocery runs, community events, without having to rely on someone else's schedule. It's deeply tied to dignity and autonomy in a way that's hard to fully explain unless you've experienced it. And that's exactly why these changes matter. Not because they're trying to take something away, but because they're trying, at least in principle, to make sure that independence can continue safely. The problem isn't the existence of the rules. The problem is how quietly they've been introduced and how many people are expected to follow them without ever having them clearly explained. But once you understand them, once you know what's expected and how to stay compliant, the entire situation shifts. Instead of feeling like something that could catch you off guard, it becomes something you can manage. You know when to renew. You know what to check. You know which conversations to have. And that knowledge alone puts you in a completely different position than someone who's still operating under the old assumptions. Because the goal here isn't to limit your ability to drive. It's to protect it, to extend it, to make sure that something as important as your independence doesn't get interrupted by a preventable issue, a missed requirement, or a rule you were never told about in the first place. And if you've been driving safely for years, decades even, this isn't about starting over. It's about making a few smart adjustments so you can keep doing what you've always done, just with a clearer understanding of how the system works. Now, so here's the bottom line, and this is the part I want to leave you with. The rules didn't change overnight, but they did change quietly, gradually, and in ways that are easy to miss if you're not actively looking for them. And that's why so many people are getting caught off guard. Not because they're careless, not because they're unsafe drivers, but because they're still playing by a version of the rules that no longer fully applies. But the moment you become aware of it, everything shifts because now you know what to check. You know the questions to ask. You know that something as simple as an eye exam, a quick call to the DMV, or a conversation with your doctor can make the difference between a smooth renewal and a stressful situation. That's not a loss of independence. That's how you protect it. And if there's one thing worth remembering, it's this. You have more control over this than it might seem. These rules aren't designed to surprise you, but without the right information, that's exactly what they do. Once you have that information, you're no longer reacting. You're prepared. So, take a few minutes after this, look up your state's requirements, double-check your renewal process. If it's been a while, schedule that eye exam. And if something we talked about today made you think of someone, a parent, a friend, a neighbor, share this with them, because the earlier someone understands these changes, the easier it is to avoid the kind of problems that seem to come out of nowhere. And if you do have questions, especially about your specific state or situation, leave them in the comments. There's a lot of variation depending on where you live, and getting a clear answer can save you time, money, and a lot of unnecessary stress. At the end of the day, this isn't about taking keys away. It's about making sure you never have to hand them over unexpectedly.